Mondays with Monsignor Pope, here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Good morning and welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey, and this morning we're going to be talking about inclusive language. I feel like the word inclusive has just become a word that nobody likes to say anymore because of its baggage. My goodness. Anyways, I could go on, but want to welcome Monsignor Charles Pope. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, this word or these words, inclusive language, I feel like it was packaged in a way to obviously incorporate incorporate everybody. Hey, I want to include my best friend or some kid that maybe nobody likes into the sport to play with, and now it's something completely different and now dangerous. What is going on?
Yeah, it's funny. We had this thing really running hot and heavy back in the 80s and 90s in this country. And I see now that it's, according to this article from CNA, it's lit up a little more in Europe. I think languages, the so-called Romance languages, a lot of people don't know what that means, but it means those languages that came from Rome, from the Latin language, that derived from Latin. They have something in their language, where their nouns and adjectives and so on are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. And this, for them, is a lot more weighty. I'm sorry, that's my morning cough. Welcome to my morning cough. I'm an asthmatic. But, I think... so it's a little bit like our pronoun wars and stuff too that's going on in this country, and it's an odd thing. All this talk about inclusion, ironically, it sort of leads to sort of a bland uniformity rather than individualism, and it's just there's so many odd backwaters. But here's, I think, theologically, Keith, there's two really big problems with this. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was this huge push by feminists largely in the church here in English-speaking countries to completely overhaul the scriptures, remove all the male pronouns related to God, replace them with just the word God or some other euphemism to work around this idea that God revealed himself in masculine and in masculine terms. Okay, and that was to completely overhaul the scriptures, top to bottom, and then including that all the texts of the liturgy, everything. There were even big proposals that came out from ISIL at that time to completely change these things. Rome finally intervened and said, "Whoa," Now that was way back then. Here's the problem with Scripture. When you start playing around with Scripture, take, for example, a lot of the Psalms. There are a lot of Psalms that are what we call messianic Psalms. They're not just referring to any dude or any girl. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord. That's not just any dude. That's Jesus. It's a messianic Psalm. It's saying, who's the one who really fears the Lord? Who's the one who perfectly reveres and holds his Father in awe? And that's Jesus. All these Psalms, you are my son, this day I've begotten you. That's a messianic Psalm. It's referring to Christ. And so to tamper with things like that, so many of these texts of the Old Testament, and just toy with them and remove masculine imagery, is to remove the messianic quality. All right, so they're pointing to Christ. So I remember one time in the early 90s, I was doing a Bible study, and we were trying to look at some of the messianic Psalms, and we all had the wrong translation, apparently, because it had all been removed, and none of it was obvious. So that's when it became very clear. I remember writing an article on that, and at the time. But so that's the first problem with Scripture. Now, the same problem, I think, comes in line with the liturgy. That the church is feminine and referred to as she, and that that Christ, of course, and God are masculine, and so on. But beyond that, Keith, there's a whole sacramental order to creation. God is Father, not because, pardon me for getting a little, not because he has male body parts, if we can put it that way. All right. God is pure spirit. But God reveals himself in masculine terms, and there's a reason for this. It isn't just arbitrary. Oh, like they all talk like that, man, and it was so patriarchal back then, dude. And it's like we're so enlightened now. It's not all about that. It's about that God to God in relation to God, everything is feminine. Why? Well, we have to put on our big boy hats and big girl hats here, and we have to talk a little bit about in the marriage act, the woman receives from the man, is acted upon by the man. The woman receives, and so on. So this is how it is with creation. All creation receives from God. God is Father, you see, and in this sense, and so this sacramental order of creation involves sexuality in the way we express and see things, everything. So look at some of the words for creation in the Romance languages. I'll just go with the Latin. The universe, universa, that's a feminine noun. A creatura, creature, that's a feminine noun. Terra, earth, that's a feminine noun. Mother Earth, and so on. So these things you see are they're feminine because they receive from God, who is pater, father, masculine. And so these are there's a theology behind God's revelation. It isn't just some arbitrary convention of the time. I better stop because I don't know if you want to make any things, but there's some more I can say about this, but I will. Yeah. But just Keith, if you want to do any rejoinders or get this guy back on track, man.
No, absolutely. I mean, it does absolutely have to fall into play with the gender ideology that is prevalent in our society today. And even Pope Francis has come out against, saying it's dangerous because it blurs the differences between the value of men and women. So it's the church is against this.
Yes. And right now, as I say, yeah, you're right. The whole situation is more in Europe than here about the language is, again, just another example of this whole gender ideology. And when you come up with this word ideology, you have to remember a lot of it's just mindless. And that's the point, is that the church has been thinking for a long time about stuff like this. What makes us, human is that we think, not just that we are ideologues. So let's go to another level of this. Why women can't be ordained priests? It all ties into to the same understanding theologically, namely that it's not just that women can't be priests because Christ was male, but rather it is because Christ is the groom and the church is the bride. Now, until 15 years ago, nobody had any doubts. Well, that's a masculine feminine thing right there. Well, yes. Back in a healthy culture before we got weird, yeah. But at the end of the day, I can say that so in other words, all throughout the Old Testament, God reveals his relationship to Israel as Israel is his bride. It's his bride. So she's the bride. And then as we come into the New Testament, again, Israel, which now includes the Gentiles as well, Israel, the church, is bride, a bride, and so and Christ is the groom. And so when you think about the beginning of Mass, for example, the priest enters and walks up the aisle, at least at a Sunday Mass, And what's that all about? It looks a lot like a wedding procession. Although in our culture, the woman, the bride usually comes up the aisle. In most cultures, especially in Jesus' time, it was the groom who made the entrance. So what's going on there is the Mass is the great wedding feast of the Lamb. It's the great sacrifice, but it's also the wedding feast of the Lamb, Christ with his bride. And he marches down the aisle like the groom entering. And remember this parable of the wise and foolish virgins and running with their lamps to meet him, and the 5 wise ones. And so we have this image, you see, of this great bridal relationship. The church is the bride of Christ. Christ is the groom. And we have this magnificent vision. And all this stuff gets jettisoned in the church when we start toying with these things. Now I know that these were things that were common in the 80s. Now we've upped the ante, and we want to start using silly things like Z. How are Z doing? I'm like, wow, yeah, that's so messed up.
You mentioned toying around with things, and I don't know if anybody that's out here has had this occur to you. Before my family and I, we found and went to a parish and grew our roots there. We found a couple parishes that edited versions of the Nicene Creed, where the line during "for us men and for our salvation," they just stripped men away and just said "for us and our salvation."
Yeah.
Like, what is a layperson to do when they see this or hear this?
Yeah, well, again, I add it right back in. It's just for us men and our salvation. Just say it a little loud and proud. But I think the point there is that in English we don't really have an inclusive term that all agree on. Like for example, Latin. The word for man, male, is vir, but the word for humankind is homo. So we have those things in other languages, but we don't. But look, let's give each other a little bit of credit and assume a little good faith. We mean men and women, right? When we say all men are sinners, and we mean that. And why not, give a little goodwill and a little good faith. Oh no, we've got to crush patriarchy. And again, there is this is kind of a holdover from the 70s and 80s. Death to patriarchy. Gloria Steinem said a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. That hatred of men is very, very common today. But listen, I know we got to start wrapping up, but I just want to say that I think I'm happy to hear that the Pope and also Cardinal Fernandez have their concerns about this. I think it's much more thorny in these other languages, and that maybe that's why this is come up with them as well. But I think it's a good sign, that every now and again we've had our differences, but these two are certainly on board with what is certainly a Christian outlook. Man, there's a glory of masculinity. There's a glory of femininity. There's two ways of being human, and we should celebrate this. Vive la différence. but the idea is that sometimes we do have to speak in ways that are inclusive of all people, and let's just assume good faith.
Absolutely.
Let's not play around and toy around with stuff.
Gosh, thank you so much once again, Monsignor Charles Pope. Always a pleasure to have you on every single Monday. But we can also find you on A Life Lived Joyfully, weekdays at 4 p.m. on Guadalupe Radio Network. But hey, if this is you and going to the office, or maybe you're finally dropped your kids off and you're going back home, stay tuned. We got a whole another hour. It's going to be great, so stay tuned, whether you're streaming from YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, so on and so forth. We'll see you right after this break. So stay tuned. See you right soon.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.